So where we stopped last, I had misspoke on the story of Sadko. So let me get this straight. Sadko is the merchant from Novgorod. Like I said, he's a character in Russian folklore. I believe there's even operas about him, poetry, music, and he is a merchant from Novgorod. And the story goes that Sadko was playing his guzli. The guzli is that instrument that's used to perform bilini, these epic oral poems. And he was sitting on the shores of Lake Ilmen playing his guzli when the lake uh, rose up and said, Sadko, I am very pleased with your playing, and I would like to give you a favor in return. What would you like? And Sadko said, I would like to make a bet with some merchants um, that you will provide me a fish at an appointed time. And so the lake agreed, and the next day Sadko came with his other merchant friends to the lake, and I bet I will command the lake, and it will provide me with a fish. And of course, all his friends thought that the lake would not provide the fish, but they had the agreement, so the lake provided a fish, and Sadko won the bet. And then Sadko is invited by the lake to select a mermaid um, at the bottom of the lake. And so that's the end of the story of Sadko, the merchant from Novgorod, who is still a character in Russian folklore. Between 1236 and 1240, the area is invaded by Mongols, and as you can see, they destroyed a lot of territory around there, but Novgorod was actually safe. It was protected because it was so swampy. The Mongols didn't want anything to do with it, so they left Novgorod alone. Um, so the fact that it was such a swampy territory actually protected it from the Mongols. So even though the rest of the area was invaded by Mongols, Novgorod remained powerful into the 1200s. It does not fall until 1478. In 1478, Ivan III takes the city, and then it becomes a part of Muscovy Rus. So if you'll remember, Kievan Rus was the state that Veliki Novgorod was a part of. Now, and then it became an independent city-state. Uh, Now it becomes a part of Muscovy Rus, which is another urban system that's the capital of which is Moscow. So Ivan III takes over the city in 1478, but it's a very long time that Veliki Novgorod is an independent city-state. So it remains a very powerful independent city-state for a very long time, again making it a very unique city in Russia. This is the layout of Veliki Novgorod in the 18th century, and I want you to notice the radial layout of the streets. So you can see here's the wall, that defensive wall. This is the first defensive wall, and then the city grew out this way, and you can see a second defensive wall built around that first wall. This is the river Volkhov. This is a German map, I believe. And you can see the forts or Kremlins all around that original wall. So these streets were laid out in a radial fashion in order for defensive purposes, so that troops could be sent out very easily if they were attacked. And they were always looking out for attacks from the Tatars, which are a Turkic-speaking group. This is the Millennium of Russia statue. This is the statue that I showed you at the very beginning of that first video. the first lecture. This is Rurik on the Millennium of Russia statue from 1862. The statue was actually taken down by the Nazis during the war, and they wanted to take it all back to Germany, but they actually broke it into pieces, and they were planning to transport it, but then the war ended, and so they were not successful in their attempts to take it back. And in 1944, the statue was re-unveiled. It was put back together. You can see the St. Sophia Cathedral in the background as well. So this Millennium of Russia statue has a number of different figures on it. We talked about Rurik. Yaroslav the Wise is also represented on there. And here you can see those inner walls, the inner defensive walls with the forts. So this is still there, a place you can visit if you go tour there. So you can see some of those walls in the forts. There's another shot. This is one of the towers, the Kukui Tower. These are what some of the houses would have looked like in Veliki Novgorod, and you can see that they're all made of wood. No nails were used here, so these are put together without any nails, and thatched roofs. Very interesting structures. Some of these are still preserved for tourism. You can see some of the detailing on the roofs here. And these are entirely wood, even all the way to the top there. The domes are also made of wood. This is another very old church, the Church of St. Lazarus. It's from the 14th century. Some of these beams would have been replaced, but you can see again the detail on the dome. And these are some other shots of houses. Very fine detail on the wood. Beautiful woodwork. And I want to show you the inside of one of these houses as well. This is still on the outside. More detail on the roof there. Very fine architecture. This is the inside, and this is a recreation of what the inside of the home would have looked like. Now you can see there's a bench here all around. Here they're spinning some sort of fiber. That's the sleeping area. This would have been the kitchen. That's the hearth. And here you can see someone embroidering and selling their work to tourists. So she's doing a traditional form of embroidery there. So we've looked at an example of a pre-Soviet city. We're also going to look at Soviet and post-Soviet cities, but let's review the pre-Soviet cities. So Veliki Novgorod is one example of a pre-Soviet city, and most of these Slavic cities appeared at the end of the 9th century. Veliki Novgorod is one of the earliest, it's one of the oldest. Historically, the settlement patterns were close to a river. Veliki Novgorod situated on the Volkhov River, so water transport was very important. They were military and economic outposts. So these are some examples. Besides Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk are all examples of pre-Soviet cities. And they all had Kremlins. They all had these forts because they had to protect themselves against these raids from Tatars, and there was constant conflict going on. So those forts are there in all of the pre-Soviet cities. And we've seen one example very closely. In 1480, the downfall of the Tatars leads to a new phase of urban settlement, the beginnings of the Muscovy Rus urban network. So if you'll remember, this is the urban network that Veliki Novgorod eventually becomes a part of. Remember, it started out as part of Kievan Rus, then it became an independent city-state, then it became part of the Muscovy Rus urban network after 1480. So Moscow here is at the center of a river system in the Muscovy Rus urban network. Moscow is the capital of that state of Muscovy Rus. And all of these, and being at the center of the river system, I should mention, would allow trade. It would also allow communication, allow economic growth, all of those things. Water was very, very important. These cities, medieval cities, were walled, so they had walls all around them. They had that radial layout that I showed you, where troops could easily be sent out from the center of the city in case of an attack. Veliki Novgorod, as I showed you, was on two sides of a river, but sometimes these cities were only on one side of a river until they had permanent bridges in the 1960s and 70s. So Veliki Novgorod was actually on both sides, but very often these cities were found only on one side of a river. Ivan the Terrible, who was a czar, defeated the Tatars in the 16th century, and Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg in 1703. Now, this founding of St. Petersburg is in a very, very swampy area. St. Petersburg area still floods to this day, and it was situated, so this was really a triumph of humans against nature, right? It's an example of humans conquering nature because they were able to build even in these swampy conditions. And this created a Western-oriented city. So the city was facing the west. If you look at the location of the city, it faces the west rather than Moscow, which faces the interior. The capital shifts from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and then back again to Moscow. By the end of the 19th century, 16% of the Russian population was urban. So in Moscow and surrounding centers, textile manufacturing was very important. That is pretty much wraps up our discussion of pre-Soviet cities. Next class we'll look at Soviet cities, and then we'll look at post-Soviet cities also. So we'll look at each of those next class.